Welcome to Canada Files. I'm Valerie Pringle. My guest today is Dr. Samantha Nutt, who is a humanitarian, a medical doctor, and founder and president of War Child Canada and War Child USA. She is also a staff physician at Women's College Hospital in Toronto, an assistant professor of medicine at the University of Toronto, and author of the book Damned Nations. She has lived a life of service, working in conflict zones around the world for almost 30 years. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Valerie.
Let's go back almost 30 years when you were a recently graduated family doctor, interest in public health, women's rights, and you signed up to go with UNICEF to Somalia. Told your parents you were going on safari.
I did. It was
probably a good thing.
The worst lie I've ever told in my entire life.
But how did being in Somalia change your life?
Well, I got this opportunity to work with UNICEF in Somalia because I was doing my master's in public health, but the research I was focusing on was the intersection between violence and women's health outcomes. So how is it that women who live with a high degree of violence end up having a disproportionate number of health concerns over their lifetime and live very short lives? And so I was recruited for that reason. And I went into Somalia believing as a young physician that I had the skills and that I would be useful in that kind of context. And it was right on the heels of the Rwandan genocide. And most of the international agencies that were deployed to work in Somalia had left to go to Rwanda. There was a second wave of famine that was gripping the country. And I arrived into an abyss of insecurity, human suffering, starvation, thinking as this young doctor that I was somewhat invincible and prepared, and I was completely unprepared. And it left me with a kind of grief and rage that I think that only people who have ever lived with war can fully recognize in themselves and in others. And the pursuit of trying to do something to prevent that kind of outcome, that kind of atrocity, especially for women and girls, that was really the moment that led me towards this particular mission. But it was, in many ways, it was a shattering experience, and I never would have thought, looking back at how I was as a teenager or in high school or even medical school, if somebody had said, well, someday you're going to be a war doctor, you know, I never would have thought that that would be true, and yet, almost 30 years later, here we are.
You know, and you've looked at this so many times now in so many places in the world and say what seems like an obvious statement, war is too high a price to pay, and yet...
And yet it's getting worse. It's getting worse. We are facing right now in the world the worst refugee and displacement crisis since World War II. More than 115 million people have been forced from their homes as a result of conflict, violence, instability, also secondary to climate change within that. The vast majority of those are civilians, 80% of them women and children. So we are facing a catastrophic level of conflict in the world that is bringing us very close to a precipice from which it will be nearly impossible for us to recover unless we're willing to invest in different outcomes that promote peace and security throughout the world, specifically for the most vulnerable, and that is often women and children.
But you've been in so many situations yourself where I guess you're lucky to be alive.
I'm very lucky to be alive, yeah. I mean, I've been in some very close calls. I've been in more than my fair share of car ambushes where I was very lucky to have survived. I've probably been threatened with sexual violence more times than it's possible to count in the course of doing this work. And yet, for me, I look at the extraordinary people that work with us, with War Child throughout the world. We have more than 600 local staff. So 99.9% of our staff throughout the world, including at the most senior level, the country director level, they come from war-torn countries. They're the ones building our programs, identifying the needs, responding to those growing demands for our services. And the only thing that they ask every day, and they're really putting their lives on the line, the only thing that they ask every day is that people like me, people who have the opportunity to fundraise and to speak and to engage bigger audiences in the conversation, that we get up and we do that. So the work is hard, the work can be scary, the work can be life-threatening. You have to be, even in the best of circumstances, you have to be extremely careful, and sometimes there are no guarantees. Look, I've lost far too many of my own friends in the course of doing this work, and my attitude to this is that, and I say this within our office all the time, I said, there is a good possibility that someday this work will kill me. Hopefully it's not today.
You know, in North America, you say we sometimes feel so far away from this, but one of the points you make over and over and over again is that North America is very involved in the form of the arms trade. Canada's involved in the form of the arms trade, and it's something we can do something about, and I think people either don't know, don't pay attention, don't understand.
They don't, and that is quite understandable. I mean, I think unless you're immersed in this kind of work all the time, you can feel as if you're a little bit disconnected from it. But yes, look, the reality is we're currently spending more than $2 trillion globally on the sort of military, basically, on arms and on military investments throughout the world. And you compare that to what we spend on international humanitarian assistance, on making sure that kids are vaccinated, that they have the chance to go to school in the most impoverished nations in the world, that they have access to food and to clean drinking water and to shelter, all of these really, really important things that will lead to stronger, better societies over the long run. That is a fraction. I mean, it's less than 1/12 of what we have in terms of military spending. Canada's heavily invested in the arms trade. We have had a $15 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia for the last several years, which is one of the most notoriously despotic countries in the world, that has been actively involved for years in the conflict in Yemen, in which almost 400,000 people have died, and other conflicts beyond that. So while I would certainly say that there is a time and a place for the military, for defense spending, to be able to legitimately defend the interests, especially of civilians, of human rights, of good governance. All of these things are really, really important. But when we think about the balance, we invest disproportionately in the machinery of our own destruction at the expense of the very things that would make us safer and more prosperous in the long term.
You started War Child Canada, 1999, sort of born of frustration, I guess, from what you'd seen, and you hadn't been at it that long. What were you trying to do differently?
I had spent about 5 years working for different international organizations and alongside them, and working for UN organizations, and we still do, to be clear. But really, War Child emerged from the gap that existed. A lot of organizations were focusing on the short term. So they were thinking about, how do you keep people alive? Food, water, shelter, blankets, healthcare. But then wars are never short term. They go on for years. In many cases, they go on for decades. And so if you're constantly relying on the distribution of short-term supplies, and people are becoming more disengaged, the funding levels decline, it's dependent on this entire expatriate international staff and their expertise, which they bring, and then as the money starts to decline, they withdraw, or things become more insecure and they have to withdraw. And then there's no capacity left behind, there are no resources left behind, and people they don't have the resilience and they don't have the skill to be able to then look after themselves and look after their own communities. And so as a public health doctor, we're trained to look at, well, how do you do the most with the least? And what kind of interventions can you scale and have the biggest impact? And what will be the most cost effective? And when you look at things like the death of children under 5, child mortality, one of the most important predictors of child mortality in the world is that child's mother's independent access to income and her education levels. So if you think about, how do you bring the deaths of kids under 5 in really complex humanitarian environments down, you have to be invested in the education of women and girls. You have to be invested in the education of those children. You have to be thinking about, how can people earn an income so they're less dependent on all of these external factors? And so trying to solve that problem and reconciling that frustration of short term, are we really moving the dial forward? That became the impetus behind War Child Canada.
And you thought, I can change this, I can do this? I mean,
I was young and naive and had a lot of energy. No, I think, look, there are times when I think, if I'd known how hard it was going to be, would I still have done it? It would have been a whole lot easier for me to have stuck with the path I was on and eventually maybe been some UN dignitary in some other part of the world. But I genuinely believe in the model of local engagement, and I genuinely believe that change happens when it's being driven by people who come from those communities. And that piece was being missed. And I also genuinely believe that you need long-term strategies and that you solve the problem of war across a generation, not across 12 months, not across 2 years, not with one goat, not with one chicken. That's not going to do it. As much as we love that on this side of the world, we want quick fixes, easy answers, we want to feel good about it.
Well, you've looked too so much at that whole issue of fundraising and, people's attention span, their guilt, the concept of charity, what drives them and what works. And usually it's not long-term engagement.
That's right. And so changing the thinking around that too has been not just important to the organization, but important to me. That's one of the reasons why I'm out there speaking and advocating and writing all of the time. It's to at least inform people of what's most effective. If you really want to make a lasting impact, you are far better off giving a smaller, regular amount to an organization on a monthly basis than writing a check once and walking away and saying, well, why do things not seem to get any better in places like South Sudan? Because education, as we all know, isn't a one-time investment. You have to keep on investing in it in order to be able to see those material gains and changes in people's lives. The recovery from war, especially with the level of trauma and violence and abuse and exploitation that people endure, you don't get over that with one session of play or something along those lines. It takes continuity and it takes deep knowledge and understanding. And so people who want to really affect change, they want to be invested in an organization over a longer stretch of time so they can start to see where they're having an impact and how they're having an impact.
So, when people say, does aid work, what do you say?
100%. 100% aid works. I've seen it. I've seen people whose lives were disrupted and destroyed, I've seen women in Afghanistan who were begging on the streets, who were functionally illiterate, and who within 2 years of being in our programming, which cost about $1,000 per head, and these are all women who were often female-headed households, so their partners had been killed in the conflict. So they're incredibly vulnerable, especially in an intensely misogynistic society where you can't just go and sell goods in the market, right? And so after 2 years of literacy and numeracy and training and psychological support, and we provided childcare and education for their kids so that they could catch up on their learning. They had all been out of school. These women were then going through and starting their own businesses and having a revolving fund and guaranteeing one another's, they weren't so much loans as they were just pooled resources. And look, they're not going to be massive entrepreneurs running billion-dollar companies, but they became women who were self-reliant and who understood the value of education and who went from being illiterate to making sure that their children's education was prioritized. And even 5 years later, when we followed up with them, their kids were still in school, and they weren't in school when they started. So that's the magic of aid when it's done in a way that is consistent. The enemy, though, of effective aid everywhere in the world is that it's too short-term, it's too narrowly focused, and it doesn't prioritize the real tools that people need to become self-reliant and to make their own choices.
You don't like the expression third world.
No.
No, I know. I always cringe when people say first world problems.
Yeah.
That whole concept of them and us.
I just look at it in the sense that we're all born into places that have certain advantages and disadvantages. And closing those gaps is one of the most powerful things that we can do.
You spent so much time with women. I love some of, you talk about a situation you're in Pakistan, I think, with a group of women, maybe refugees from Afghanistan.
Yes.
Ended up talking about sex.
Everywhere in the world, wherever you go.
And one of them was about to be married, and they're asking you about your wedding night. You think,
and she says to me, she goes, "So was it like that for you, the first time you had sex with your husband on your wedding night?" And I'm like, oh, this is a really sensitive conversation. So we come from very different worlds, but yeah, look, it's amazing to me that it's funny when I started doing this work. In fact, even just recently, I was at the UN peacekeeping compound in South Sudan in Malakal, and I'm pretty much the only female. Well, there are about 3 of us, and there are about 300 men, NGO folks, and soldiers. And I thought, how am I still so outnumbered doing this work? But when I started in Somalia too, it was the same. I was often the only woman. And people would think, well, this is unusual. And I would be going across borders with these various armed groups, and I'd walk in the middle of the night, and they're all sitting there with their weapons and drinking and smoking and everything else. And sometimes they would just think I was a complete joke, which actually worked to my advantage, because they're like, oh, sure, go ahead, right? But the one advantage to being a woman is that I have had extraordinary access to women's stories and their lives. And you sit together, and everywhere in the world, no matter what, women talk. And they talk about the most intimate details of their lives. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Afghanistan or you're in Iraq with Yazidi women and girls, or you're in Eastern Congo. You put a bunch of women together and the stories come out. And if I were anything other than a woman doing this work, none of that would have been possible.
Tell a wonderful story in your book, Damned Nations, about a woman named Nadia.
Mm-hmm. This one afternoon, I was visiting Ward Tilt's programming in West Darfur and Janina, which has become the epicenter of this current crisis, unfortunately. And we'd been running this literacy and numeracy program for women and girls in the evenings, which had become a safe place for them to be, because there's a significant amount of rape and sexual violence in the camp. So they would come with their children. It was safe, they were protected, and they were learning at the same time. And I started talking to Nadia, and she had her little baby boy right beside her on this mat, and she'd been attending every night for 3 months. And that frustration I've had from the moment I landed in Somalia, where you see these programs in action, but you think there's a part of you that can't let go to this idea of, what's the point? It's just so much bigger. And what's happening is so unjust, and it's never going to get better. And you feel as if you're just some kind of incomplete apology sometimes for just the way the world is. And on that particular day, I started talking to Nadia, and she explained how she had been in her village. She had just given birth to this little boy, and I'm the mom of a son. And she heard the Janjaweed militias, and she heard people screaming, and her mother and her father and her husband yelled to her to go and hide behind their family farm, which she did with her baby, trying to keep him quiet. And the Janjaweed militias ended up executing all of her family members. It set fire to her farm. She was one of only a dozen women and children who survived this attack. She walked for days to get to this camp. And as I'm sitting there talking to her, knowing that she'd been in our program for 3 months, she was completely illiterate when she started, like all the girls in her village. I said to her, Nadia, after everything you've been through, has any of this actually helped you? And it was one of the most profound moments that I've experienced doing this work, and I think a very powerful reminder of why it matters. As she was sitting on this mat, she leans forward, and then she just wrote her name in the sand. And then she said, now that I know how to write my own name, I'm going to learn how to write my son's name. And I thought, that's it. That's it. We all just need a reason to put one foot in front of the other. We all need to aspire to a better day. And sometimes they're elusive. But if we can invest in that sense of it's possible that it will get better, it changes people's lives.
How do you cope? How do you sleep? How do you unsee what you've seen?
You don't unsee it. And thank God, actually.
You bear witness.
I think you'd have to be a kind of callous sociopath to unsee it. I think you get to a point, which for me was very early on, where you can't go back. You can only go forward. And the only thing that drives you forward is this realization that you are able to make an impact. And so you end up, it's this weird space, it's this weird paradox, right? Where you sometimes you feel like you can't live with it, but you also can't live without it. That it is the thing that haunts you, but it is the thing that sets you free. It's the thing that makes it make sense. You can only understand and contextualize and rationalize the suffering and the horror and abuse and the nights of shelling and the visions of gunfire and the occasional nightmares, which I will sometimes still have. I had some very serious ones coming out of South Sudan recently. The only way that you can push through those is when you see the tremendous hope and opportunity and change that comes out of what you're doing. And that's the stuff that makes you brave, because I'm not brave. But I'm working with a bunch of people who are extraordinarily brave. And if all they need me to do is to get my ass out of bed, even if I've had a nightmare, even if I've had a bad night's sleep, even if I think I'm tired and jet lagged, they aren't asking for very much. It's the least I can do.
And yet, you know, it's been quite a life. It's been a real journey. And I wonder how you sort of explain and see your life of service.
It's been a privilege. I can't imagine, look, it's the most extraordinary thing in the world to be able to do a job that is your passion, that is your commitment, that aligns with your values as a human being, that puts you at the front line of some of the most intimate moments of people's lives. That's true being a doctor. It's especially true being a war doctor. I've seen parts of the world and met people that it's irreplaceable. So when I think about my life, I think, wow, it's been amazing. And as much as I've had really difficult, scary moments, I also think in a way it's been extraordinarily liberating, because it teaches you to prioritize things very, very differently. And I live my life, as hard as the war zone stuff is, with extraordinary energy and joy. And I'm one of those people, like, if it's a dance party, I'm all in, you know? I'll go for 9 hours. And that's how I love. That's how I love my family, my friends. You have to be all in, because every second is precious. And there's nothing that brings you closer to that realization than being confronted by what happens when it's stolen from you.
The final question we ask is, what does being Canadian mean to you?
Everything. What an extraordinary gift we have. We are, as a Canadian, we live in a society that is imperfect, certainly. Our history is deeply imperfect. There's a lot that we have to reconcile. But at the same time, we can send our children to school with a degree of confidence that they won't experience horrific sexual violence or be murdered on the way there. We don't fall asleep as millions of people do throughout the world, listening to the staccato of automatic gunfire, feeling the deep vibrations of those bombs in the darkest of night and wondering whether we'll be next or how we're ever going to keep our children safe in that context. I've lived some of that, and I know what that feels like. And every time I land here, back in Canada, and I can close my eyes and that is not my reality, I am so thankful and grateful to call myself a Canadian.
Well, Godspeed to you, Dr. Nutt.
Thank you.
Your work's amazing.
Thank you. And thank you for doing this. I appreciate it.
We'll be back next week with another episode of Canada Files.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of the Browning Watt Foundation, as well as the following donors: Ted and Alice Kernahan, Tony and Sherry Fell, Mary Davey, Michael McCain and family, David and Cheryl Carr, Bryce and Nikki Douglas, Richard Wernham and Julia West, Earl and Janice Oborn, the Linwood Family Foundation, Steve and Catherine Coxford, Richard Pilosoff, Clinch House Foundation, the 63 Foundation, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association,